to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 77, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I am over the virus that took me out last week, but now it's allergy season, and so my voice is still a little goofy. I hope it doesn't make listening to me too awful. I know I've said this before, but this year is just flying by. I can't believe that this week it's already going to be May. And while we haven't had a warm spring, it hasn't been cold either. We've had years where April and May have been in the 40s, and we're getting up close to the high 50s and low 60s. Everything in my greenhouse looks great. The husband and I planted potatoes this weekend. We got piglets last Saturday, and they're out on the pasture. And I have 10 chicks in the brooder box, and in another week or so, they'll be going to the chicken coop. So it's spring. There's lots of stuff happening here on the farm. I'm still managing to get a little bit of sewing in here and there. I made some more stars, sawtooth stars for my Bernina University jacket. Last week was registration for the Bernina University classes, and I got into a great variety of classes. We're going to be there for 4 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, so the schedule is jam-packed. I've got a class with Amanda Murphy. I've got a class with Gail Yellen. I've got some classes on garment sewing. I have some classes on quilting with the embroidery hoop on Bernina machines. It's going to be a great weekend, and I can't wait to learn a whole bunch of new stuff. I suspect that Joann Fabrics is only going to be around for maybe another week or two. Ours is fairly empty. They're closing down parts of the store. They've got it taped off and moving things to consolidate them in one area. I'm not finding any fabric that I want to buy. I've picked up a few things here and there, some notions, but it's pretty much over for Joann Fabrics. And I'm starting to get a tiny little bit nervous because this week I got an email from Issaquah Sewing and Vacuum. So Issaquah Sewing and Vacuum is a little store that is in Issaquah, Washington. It's right off of I-90 where you come down off of Snoqualmie Pass and you're heading into Seattle proper. And if you get off at one of the Issaquah exits, there used to be a quilt store there called the Gossipium Quilt Shop. It was in a little fancy shopping center, darling store, lots of really interesting things. I've shopped there a couple of times, and then about a mile west of them down the same road was Issaquah Sewing and Vac. And there was a Hobby Lobby. There is a Hobby Lobby across from Issaquah Sewing and Vac. But I love to go to Issaquah Sewing and Vac because they were a Wonderfill dealer. And so if I needed a spool or two of Wonderfill thread, I could always pick it up there. And I got an email from them today that the owner wants to retire. They've tried for 2 years to find a buyer for the store and weren't able to. So they are starting their closing sale this week. This is a tough economic environment for independent fabric stores, and I totally get it. I understand wanting to retire, so I can't blame people for closing their stores that after they've been in business for 40 years. I guess we'll have to see how this all shakes out. The other project that I've been working on in my sewing room was another pair of free-range slacks. It's a Sew House 7 pattern. I am teaching a class on this in June, and so I made a class sample a couple of weeks ago. But I like the pattern so much that I wanted to make a few more pairs for myself. So one of the things that I did was I lengthened them to full length. The pattern is for a full-length pair of cigarette-style pants or a cropped pair of wide-leg pants. So I took the wide-leg version and I lengthened it and made myself a pair out of some black Essex linen, which is a 45% linen, 55% cotton blend fabric from Robert Kaufman. One can never go wrong with a pair of black linen pants for summer. And I finished those yesterday, and I think I might be wearing them tomorrow to teach in. I'm teaching the Scout Tee at our local quilt store, and I think I might wear the free-range slacks with a Scout Tee to teach the class in. For today's episode, I have an interview with Ellen Postlewaite, who is a staff member at the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture in Spokane, Washington. And I reached out to Ellen because even though the museum isn't in a huge metropolitan area, it's got a fascinating textile collection. And one of the groupings of items in the collection is flour sacks. And I asked Ellen if she would come onto the show and give us a little tour, kind of a virtual tour. I know it's hard to do it without video, but talk about the flour sacks in the collection, where they came from, how they were acquired. The interesting thing about their collection is, and if you go and look at it online, you'll be able to see this. These aren't flour sacks like you think of as the 30s reproduction flour sacks necessarily, but they were flour sacks that were intended to set each flour mill apart from its competitors. And so they were designed to be branding and marketing and things you don't necessarily think about happening at that point in history. These flour sacks were also a way to get people to buy the grain that came in cotton sacks rather than the paper sacks that were starting to be used. And again, it's a fascinating form of marketing. And then we do veer off into a couple of other topics because I've been to some of their exhibits and they really do have a very unique textile collection. So if Spokane is ever a destination for you, I highly recommend the museum, the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture. They've also got a website where you can view some of these items that Ellen will be talking about, and I will make sure that that link is in the show notes. So without further ado, here is my interview with Ellen Postlewaite of the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture. So Ellen, welcome to the podcast. I'm so thrilled that you agreed to be here.
Thank you.
And you tell me your title. You are?
So I'm the curator of history and Campbell House at the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture.
Okay. And the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture is in Spokane, Washington. And we were talking a little bit before we started the podcast that I live here in the Inland Northwest. And so I've been to the museum and to Campbell House a couple of times to see your exhibits. And
Excellent.
so that was why I reached out to you about the flour sacks. Unfortunately, when you had the flour sack exhibit, I didn't make it over there. That's how it goes.
That's how it goes sometimes. The timing doesn't always work.
Right. How long has the museum been in operation?
So we're coming up on 100 years, actually. The Historic Society was founded in, I was going to say 1912, and now I think it might be 1915. But our first formal building was in the historic Campbell House initially. So in 1924, the family donated it, and by 1926, it had opened initially as the Grace Campbell Memorial Museum and kind of went through a few names, and now we are the Northwest Museum.
I find it so interesting. The Campbell family were mining barons, is that correct?
They did make their money in the silver mines of northern Idaho. Yeah, kind of expanded into other things once they made their money a little bit later in life and kind of settled in Spokane when it was a big boom town, and then invested in other things. But silver mining is where they got their start.
Okay. And we have the Conrad Mansion here in Kalispell with the
Yeah, built by
Conrad
the same
family.
architect.
Yes. So that's kind of a neat connection. So we're going to talk today about the flour sack collection that the museum has. And it's been on display previously, but I didn't make it over there to see the exhibit. But I find it fascinating. Eastern Washington, maybe people don't know who've never been to this area, is a huge wheat growing area.
Yes, it is funny. By the 1880s, 1890s, the Inland Northwest, like Spokane was considered the capital of the Inland Empire. And that wasn't really an exaggeration. At the time, Spokane was this kind of major hub here in the territory for railway. It was how you connected across the country, and the natural resources we have here are abundant. And so, we have the falls here in the city proper, but also you have logging and other agricultural opportunities. And that's where grain really quickly became a big deal. By the 1880s, I'm checking my dates here, but by 1900, we were seventh in the nation for milling capabilities for grain. So it really quickly became kind of a center of industry for our area here in the inland Northwest.
How did the museum acquire this flour sack collection?
So it's kind of interesting. A few of them came to us, from individuals over time, but we did have two kind of large collections that make the bulk of what was on display and the bulk of our collection of about 150 flour sacks. One was W.A. Peters, and he actually was the owner of the Spokane Flour Mill. And so he very kindly donated some of the different examples over the years that he had saved. And then our largest collection is from Chuck Smith, and he had worked for the Centennial Mill company for over 30 years, and over that time had slowly started collecting things to the point that people started to know that about him. So then when the Seattle mill closed, they actually sent him some additional items, including some really beautiful prints of about 10 of what would become designs on flour sacks. So those are kind of the two largest donors of the collection, which is really wonderful. If you've been to Spokane, you might have visited the flour mill, which now has a restaurant and a couple different restaurants and some neat small businesses in it. And that was part of when the Centennial Mill closed. That was part of the incentive for donating some materials to us, is because they were cleaning out office spaces in that building and found a bunch of things. And we got to be the ones that ended up with a bunch of it.
Oh, that's so cool. I have actually been to the flour mill, and now
Just across the water from us.
if I go again, I'll know exactly what I'm looking at. So, can you describe the flour sacks? Are they all cotton? Are they other materials?
The majority of them are cotton, because that's kind of one of the interesting part of the, as I understand it, incentive for collecting them and kind of looking at how things had changed over that time is the cotton manufacturers. That's where you get that really interesting switch in the design, because when paper starts to compete, the cotton manufacturers, that's when you get the more elaborate patterns on the bags, and they want you to upcycle them. And because they knew people were doing that already, and so why not make it even more appealing so that when you're walking through the store, it's like, oh, I want to make an apron with that pattern, so I'm going to go buy it. So the majority of everything we have in our collection is cotton. And then that's kind of a fun, it documents that moment where you go from kind of just general marketing to more branding specific by the like late 1890s into the 1900s. And then the marketing up through the 40s really takes a dramatic turn.
When you say marketing, so these companies develop their own prints?
Yes, so they hired artists, and that's one of the things that I particularly like about the collection we have here, is that about 90% of what is produced in our region is exported, and it's been that way since the 1880s. I wrote the date because this always is amazing to me. It was in the 1880s, I believe, that the first uh, nope, even earlier. It was 1868. The first shipment of grain from the Washington Territory was from Walla Walla to Liverpool. And that didn't change the entire time. And so as technology kind of advanced and you were getting more competitive with your branding and you were selling a brand and not just a product, they were hiring artists that were making these really gorgeous designs on something that seems as simple as a flour sack. And so particularly for like Centennial Mills collection, you'll see that we have examples of flour sacks that were sold through Hong Kong merchants. So they have really like interesting design, and it's not in English, it's in, Mandarin or whatever the language of that area that they were going to sell it to is in. We also have some that were sent they were being sold in El Salvador. So the designs kind of mimic what would have been appealing to that market. And then we even have a few that were sent to the Philippine Islands for that market. So then you see another iteration of the design trying to appeal to that specific branch of people. We were really competitive here on the West Coast, and still are in a lot of ways. But instead of 150 mills in the Washington Territory, we now only have two, which is wild.
Do you know much about the dyes that they use to print the design?
Um, Not specifically, but that is one of the things you kind of see a change in the timeline as well, because they actually, to be in that era of trying to be competitive against paper, you see they start to use different inks that are easier to wash out and less permanent, so that if you're a housewife making clothes for your children, you can scrub it a few times and get most of the ink out of it, and then have basically, blank muslin or cotton in front of you to make whatever you wanted. So the what was in the ink changes over time as well.
Are there items in the collection that are finished items, or is it all flour sacks?
The majority is flour sacks, but we do have a few fun objects made from them. One of my favorites is we have a dress that is lined on the inside with flour sack material from the first flour mill in Spokane that was on Havermill Island. So if you've been in Riverfront Park, you've probably walked across the bridges and across Havermill Island, where there was the first roller mill in Spokane. Initially, there was a grist mill in the 1870s, and then 1878, Minneapolis, a fellow over there invents the steel roller, which kind of changed the game. And so then within 2 years, Spokane is producing, like, builds its first steel roller mill, the name of which escapes me. So it's this kind of beautiful, corseted kind of cream and brown kind of checkered pattern with a little bustle. And on the inside, if you flip it inside out, which on our website you can see with the object record, we have the outside, I believe, shown as well. And you can still see they didn't, since it was going on the inside, they didn't bother to try and hide any of the material. So you can see all of the labeling still all through the inside of this really beautiful dress.
That would
That's
be
probably my favorite. We've also got like a really beautiful nightgown that you would never suspect was an egg mash bag. We've got a really cool quilt, actually several quilts that are faced with flour sack material. Got a neat apron, some children's clothes. So we've got a little sprinkling, kind of a variety of materials.
how do you store and repair these items? Because time takes its toll.
Yes, it does. Well, the biggest enemy that we fight in a museum is light. That is always the biggest challenge. And so we have actually in our history collection two spaces, and one of them is dedicated entirely to our textile collection. So that's where, you know, all of the objects that we're talking about live. And most of the flour sacks are, stored laying flat. So there's the least kind of tension or stress on the material in acid-free materials, and, special boxes that live in their shelves away from the light. And then the quilts and the larger objects, we have large rollers, because that's kind of the best way to store them without getting like too strong a seams or like really affecting the fabric that way too. And then it's all temperature controlled, and as with our other storage spaces, to kind of try and keep the environment as stable as possible, which
Sure.
is also why some of the objects, once they go out on display for a while, we actually there's kind of, depending on what the material is made of, certain amounts of time that we like them to stay unused so that they can kind of settle again after being exposed for so long to the elements. Because, I mean, the way to perfectly preserve something is to put it in a vacuum, but then nobody'd get to see it. And why would we keep it? So always trying to balance how long and how often things can come out, but also maintaining their integrity so that they last for another 100 years. So,
I do remember seeing some signs to that effect that these items are on display now, but then they will go back into storage and they won't come out for X number of years.
Particularly with textiles, they can, depending on the material, can be really sensitive to light. So, you're always kind of weighing the risk against the object. Like in our one of the exhibits we just opened, we have two silk banners from the 18, let's see, one is in the 1870s, I think the other is the 1880s, and they were made with silk, which has one in particular of the two has shattered. And so we've made an additional little note to the side because we have it netted and really strategically lit at a very specific level. And this is the last time that it'll be out on display until it gets some conservative attention because it's just the damage of time and the elements has been to a point where now, if we want to display it again, we're going to need to bring in an expert who can help us stabilize the object so that it's safe. So, always trying to weigh the balance.
I do remember going to a couple of, at least one of your quilt exhibits where it was very dim in there. You understand that because you don't want the light to damage. And I'm sure, especially with dyes and things like that, it would fade.
Yeah, the fading is a big, particularly with some of those yeah, depending on the type of textiles, like with the flour sacks, with the way the ink has been printed, fading is a big concern. But this is also part of why we work really hard to digitize as much of the collection as possible. So if there's a detail you couldn't see as well when you were there, maybe you have a chance to go home and you can pull up the image and look at it a little bit closer. So that's we're always trying to keep that updated because when we had a really neat show called Memory and Meaning, and it had the Bengali quilt on display, which is one of our most unique objects that we have here at the museum. And it's quite large, this quilt. And we had, because of its age and the integrity of the material, we had it at a fairly low angle raise flat. And then we had above it a projection of the design so that you could kind of see what was hard to see because it was like white on white, so it was already a little difficult. But it was funny because we had there's some very active quilting groups in Spokane, and I had a couple tours that I led through there where they were very frustrated with me that I wouldn't let them reach over and flip it over so that they could see the back of the quilt. And it was like, not that I don't appreciate how much you want to see it, but in this scenario, please don't touch it. So it was always kind of funny, but having it available online hopefully crosses that bridge a little bit for people where we can, you know, explain why we have to display it a certain way, but then give you access to those closer details so you can still look as close as you want. Or make an appointment and sneak in and we'll pull things so you could get a closer look, all the different options.
I do remember seeing the Bengali quilt, and I thought that that was very clever that you projected above so
Wasn't
that,
that fun?
yes, so that you
I
could
really
see
thought
the
that came
missing
together well.
pieces. Yeah, that was a great idea. Do
And what a cool story.
It was a very
Just
cool
that's
story.
a full tangent on that one, but very cool.
We may have to do another, we'll do another podcast interview on that quilt. I'm curious, have any of the prints from the flour sacks?
I mean, when I saw the three that we have, they looked kind of modern. Like I felt like I could walk into a fabric store and have seen a couple of those. So of the examples that we have, because we've got three with a couple of each design, and one has like a teddy bear on it. The other is a black and white stripe pattern, kind of pinstripe that, you know, I would totally use on something today probably. And then the other one has like green polka dots and like a little cherub face kind of in there. So it is funny. I don't know if anyone has exactly reproduced them, but they definitely look you see a photo of them, and these were kept in really excellent condition and they were never used, so they're like pristine. And you would think you could go buy that around the corner right now, and it would not surprise me.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about the collection that you want to highlight?
I kind of got most of my favorite bits out. I've just been fascinated because the Golden Harvest exhibition, we had a guest curator, Dana Bown, who's like, you know, expert researcher on textiles of that era and did all of this amazing research. And I was actually watching before this over her little tour that she gave me and some of the details she shared. And I love the story of how far flung materials from here have made it around the world and how crazy it is that at the time, like to get, you know, in the 1890s to actually ship something to Hong Kong, it was farmers taking horse and carriage to the Snake River and then putting it on a barge. And then that treacherous journey down the river, where you finally get to a port, put it on a ship, and then it has to go around the tip of Cape Horn of South America and then all the way back up to Liverpool or continuing on its way. So it's just mind-boggling to me that these things made it so far and is just so interesting. And I like the designs. I highly recommend looking. Most of them are digitized so you can actually see them online and they're just beautiful. And like the art that they did on these is stunning. And there was one that Dana loved to talk about where you see a figure. It was for the Hong Kong markets out of that port, and you see a figure standing next to what looks like a large fish, and then there's some decorative trees around it. And she did some research into it, and it's supposed to remind you of a tradition where whoever the most talented academics and philosophers were, they had to kind of compete, and then whoever was considered the best, there was this ceremonial like fish that you would stand on and be presented to the emperor, and it was like a sign of how far you had excelled and how good you were. So by putting this on your bag of flour, you're saying that we are the best one. When you walk through your local market and you're looking at your options available, clearly we are the best because we would be in this situation as well. And I just love like that is the level that they were considering these beautiful designs to try and, get you to buy their flour over somebody else's.
Instead of just putting the name of the mill on the bag and leaving it at that.
We also, oh, and I've thought of another random thing that I thought was so fun in that show that I had never really considered, but we have code books because, of course, with like telegrams and early forms of, not only paper written communication, you were charged by the letter and this like the space. So you wanted to keep things concise, but also it was such a competitive industry so immediately in our area that those code books were actually highly regarded and the code words were really a big deal because you didn't want your, you know, someone to get paid off and then tell your competitor how much wheat you were shipping or how much you were charging. So we have a couple in our archives, a couple code books that have all the different references for how you were traveling or how much was there if there was a problem and you didn't want somebody to know about it. What were the letters or the combination of words that you could use to share that? And so specifically for like particularly the grain industry, we've got a couple, I think from that Centennial Mills fellow, if I'm remembering right. But that I just thought that was so interesting because on the practical side, makes sense. You want to keep it short because you're paying by the letter, but also a little sneaky because you didn't want anyone to get, find out too much if they shouldn't know about it.
Who knew? Who knew that it was that cutthroat?
Right? Isn't that funny? And that ratio is still like the number of mills has changed, but the amount of export is pretty much the same. So we still, in our area, export the majority of what is grown here, which is crazy.
That is crazy, with only two remaining mills.
That is, as I understand it, yep. And at least one of them is owned now by like a global conglomerate, I think.
Okay.
So like the whole landscape has kind of changed for how those businesses are run.
You talked a little bit about when they went from cloth bags to paper bags. When did that transition happen?
That was by the mid 20s.
Okay.
Things were moving to paper because then by the 30s, the mills were starting to produce actually booklets as well to go with them that you could buy that had patterns in them. So they were really trying to encourage, and then that's what the depression hits, and then they become even more important as a resource for people. So yeah, it was in the 20s there when paper starts to like the production of that industrializes to a point where they're starting to make paper bags for things. And so then the cotton manufacturers kind of bandy together and try to come up with a plan to keep themselves competitive in that particular business.
Do you have some of the pattern books as well?
I don't believe so, which would be fun, but not that I've come across so far.
Oh, that would be fascinating.
Right? And they would also publish them in the paper. You could find patterns occasionally there. Um, So yeah, they were really trying hard to like convince both the mill that you should continue to buy cotton and the people that you should avoid the paper bag and buy ours instead.
How big would you say the entire textile collection is? And maybe that's an odd question because how would you quantify it?
Yeah.
But I know that
Um,
you have the quilts and you have the flour sacks. You had a
mhm,
beautiful, I don't know whether it's a standing exhibit, a beautiful embroidery exhibit at one point
mhm.
that I remember going through. And that was kind of a light bulb moment for me because I do a lot of handwork and I do love embroidery, but I tend to think of it as kind of frippery. It actually isn't. That was how you identified your clothing before labels were created. Little kids who have their names sewn into their clothing now, before they were able to do that, you embroidered things onto your garments or your possessions so that you would know what belonged to you.
Did any of it have Pearl Allen in it?
It
Do you
m-
remember?
it might have, but this has got to be. It was before the pandemic, I think.
Ah, yeah, yeah. Just it's one of my other kind of favorite little collections in our textile collection because I guess it's not as much embroidery. You just said that and it reminded me, but we have this really neat assortment of material from her where she took the foot off of her treadle sewing machine
I
and
did see that.
yeah, yeah, and she recipes, poems, stories, kind of diary entries about her day. She would just use her sewing machine with the treadle and in amazing cursive. Like it's wild I can't even write as well as she managed to stitch in all of these beautiful letters and
Right?
like little designs. And so we have hankies and tablecloths and all these kind of materials that she just made for herself. And I love that we have them. They're such a neat, like both technically beautiful, in my opinion, because of the way she managed to use what she had and make these gorgeous things, but also a window into her life. Like they become these really interesting, you know, like material pieces of her experience living in our area and the things she remembered and the things that were important to her. And so, oh, it's one of my favorite collections because I just think it's such a neat, kind of unique way to document your life.
I remember looking at that collection and thinking, I have trouble doing machine embroidery on my modern sewing machine. And here's this woman who was doing it on a treadle.
Right? And that's the part too, that it's a treadle. Like I have a hard enough time keeping a straight stitch like in a straight line on a normal day, let alone taking away all of the things to help make it easier.
Right? Yeah, your museum does have some very unique pieces.
It makes it fun. We've got all these cool stories of folks from the inland Northwest. And as I'm trying to think like how to comment on how big of a collection it is, I mean, we've got like 60,000 objects in our history collection as a whole, and at least a third, if not more, of that is all represented in our textile collection because we've got a truly amazing quilt collection. We've got some really interesting clothing that ranges from the like technically 1700s on to more contemporary present day. We have flags and banners and costumes, and we have so many hats and shoes. Our collection's a little funny. Textile includes some of our accessories, so we've got this really amazing hat collection and shoes. Our cane collection is actually really interesting, which is funny to say. Um, yeah, we've just got a really neat kind of glimpse, and are always, I mean, it's the battle against everything of, we have only so much space, but are always still trying to collect and look for those other neat examples of different stories.
I grew up on the East Coast, and things back east always seem so much older to me because the history goes back further. When we moved out to Montana 30 years ago, I was like, there just isn't a lot of old stuff here.
Way history has been preserved here before, like, white settlers ended up out here was just not as didn't make as much of a physical mark on the landscape in the same way. So much of it is that kind of 1860s and on that you really start to see so much more as the boom towns and everything kind of moves out this direction.
Well, great. I really appreciate this. Is there anything else that I should ask you?
Oh, I've got so many stories. I could go on. I could go on and
We
on.
we could we could probably talk for hours.
No, but thank you for inviting me on. I love any excuse to talk about the cool stuff we've got.
And can you talk a little bit about, you said some of the designs are viewable on your website?
Yeah, so if you go to the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture website and into the object collection uh, area, there is a spot where you can search our collections. And you can either search photos through the archives or you can search objects. And we're actually working on updating that right now, so it might look a little different in the next few months, which is very exciting. We've got some cool easier in some ways for people to see more in a way that we're all really excited about. So that'll be happening hopefully soon here. But if you go into the object collections search, you can search by keyword or by maker and see almost everything we have digitized. We're still always trying to catch up. Those 60,000 objects are a lot to get through, and some of them, were older photos, trying to take nice new ones, and so the process is ever evolving. But you can find for sure all of the material from the Golden Harvest Flour Sack exhibition there, as well as all of our quilts, which is one of our kind of really neat textile collections that we have.
Great. I will make sure that I put a link in the show notes. Hopefully, we will talk again in the future. You can tell that I'm kind of a museum nut and a textile history nut. There was a period of time where we thought our younger daughter might become a museum curator because she really likes museums too. And I think she must have gotten that from me. But I hope you enjoyed the interview, and I'd really encourage you to go to the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture website and check out their online search function. You can look up the pictures, photos of the feed sacks. You can also look up some of Pearl Allen's machine embroidery work that she did with her treadle sewing machine. The quilts are on display through the online search too, and it's just a lot of eye candy. And that link will be in the show notes. I really appreciate the ratings and reviews that people are leaving at Apple Podcasts. I love to pull that up and see what people are saying. So I appreciate the kind words. I will continue to try and bring you the kind of content that you want to listen to. You can send emails to me at janet@janetzabo.com. You can leave a comment on the show notes page. You can use the fan mail feature. My website is at www.janetzabo.com with links to my blog. If you want to see cute pictures of piglets or chicks, that's the place to go right now because that's what I'm putting up there. I expect to have an episode next week, but the week after that I probably won't because I am going to be traveling to Seattle for Mother's Day. And I won't be back in time to get a podcast up on that Tuesday. So there will be a week-long break in between podcasts, but that'll give you the opportunity to go back and catch up. So until next time, I hope you have a great week or two and that you get to go sew something.